Jin's hands shook as she stared at the data on her screen. The numbers didn't lie. After 3 years of working on the research vessel Stellar Dawn, she had finally discovered why Captain Du-1 kept certain labs off-limits to most of the crew. The young Neorian scientist rubbed her silvery temples, her large, almond-shaped eyes reflecting the soft blue glow of the computer screen. Like all members of her species, her skin had a pale, pearlescent sheen that seemed to shimmer under the ship's lights. But right now, that shimmer was dulled by stress and fear. She double-checked the test results. The biological samples they had collected from planet KX-291 weren't being used for medical research as Captain Du-1 had claimed. Instead, he was developing weapons, horrible weapons that could wipe out entire species. This went against everything the Galactic Council stood for. "Computer, copy these files to my personal drive," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the ship's engines. The computer beeped in response, and Jin quickly tucked the small data crystal into her pocket. She had to confront him. As the ship's lead researcher, it was her duty. But more than that, it was the right thing to do. The walk to the captain's quarters felt longer than usual. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, and Jin's heart beat faster with every meter she covered. The ship's night cycle meant most of the crew was asleep, leaving the hallways eerily quiet. When she reached Du-1's door, she took a deep breath and pressed the call button. A moment later, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Captain Du-1 sat at his desk, his own silvery skin looking almost gray in the dim light. His facial ridges, a sign of age among their people, were more pronounced than usual, creating deep shadows across his features. "Jin, what brings you here at this hour?" he asked, his tone friendly enough. But there was something cold in his eyes. "Captain, I need to talk to you about the research in Lab 7, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I found something concerning." Du-1's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on his desk. "Come in, please. Close the door behind you." Jin stepped inside, her hand unconsciously touching the data crystal in her pocket. "Captain, the samples we've been collecting, you're not using them for medical research. You're developing biological weapons." "Ah." Du-1 stood up slowly, walking around his desk. "And how did you come to this conclusion?" "I analyzed the test results. The modifications you're making to the local fauna's genetic structure. They're designed to create aggressive, uncontrollable mutations. This violates at least 15 Galactic Council treaties." Du-1 smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You always were too smart for your own good, Jin. Just like your mother was." Jin felt a chill run down her spine. Her mother had died in a lab accident 10 years ago, or at least that's what she'd been told. "What do you mean?" "Your mother also discovered things she shouldn't have. She also thought she should do the right thing." He walked closer, his voice growing quieter. "Do you know what happens to people who try to stop progress, Jin? They become obstacles, and obstacles must be removed." Jin backed away toward the door, but Du-1 pressed a button on his desk. The door locked with a loud click. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice now frighteningly calm, "we're scheduled to collect more samples from the surface. You'll be leading the expedition, of course. Unfortunately, there might be an accident. Equipment malfunctions are so common on these dangerous worlds." "You won't get away with this," Jin said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The Council will investigate." Du-1 laughed softly, "Just like they investigated your mother's death." "Jin, who do you think funds this research?" "There are forces within the Council itself who understand that sometimes we must take extreme measures to protect our interests." The next 12 hours passed in a blur. Jin was confined to her quarters, officially to prepare for the expedition. She tried sending messages to the Council, but all communications were blocked. She could only watch helplessly as the time ticked away. When morning came, she was escorted to the shuttle bay. The small research pod waited for her, its silver hull gleaming under the bay lights. Two security officers watched as she suited up in her environmental protection gear. "Captain Du-1 sends his regards," one of them said, handing her the sample collection kit. "He says to be extra careful down there. The local wildlife can be unpredictable." He-Jin took the kit with trembling hands. As she boarded the pod, she noticed that her emergency beacon had been tampered with. The backup power supply was missing. If anything went wrong, she would have only a few hours to call for help. The pod's door sealed shut, and the launch sequence began. Through the viewport, she could see Du-1 watching from the control room, his face expressionless. The descent to KX 291's surface was rough. The planet's atmosphere was thick with purple clouds, and strong winds buffeted the small pod. He-Jin struggled to maintain control, but something was wrong with the steering systems. They weren't responding properly. When she was about 50 meters from the ground, the pod's engine suddenly cut out. He-Jin barely had time to brace herself before the pod slammed into the surface, skidding across the purple soil before coming to rest at the edge of a dense forest. The impact had cracked her helmet's visor, but the emergency sealant had activated, keeping the planet's toxic atmosphere at bay. He-Jin checked her emergency beacon. It was damaged, barely functioning. She had maybe 2 hours of broadcast power left. Through the pod's cracked viewport, she could see the stellar dawn still visible in the purple sky above. As she watched, its engines flared to life, and the ship began to move away. "No," she whispered, pressing her hand against the cold glass. "Please." But the ship continued to grow smaller until it was just a bright dot in the sky, and then it was gone, leaving her alone on a world that was home to some of the most dangerous creatures in known space. In the distance, something roared, a deep, resonating sound that made the pod's metal walls vibrate. He-Jin checked her supplies: 3 days of emergency rations, a basic medical kit, and a small energy pistol that wouldn't do much against the larger predators. She pulled up the planet's data on her suit's computer. Average surface temperature, 40 degrees Celsius. Atmosphere, toxic to most carbon-based life forms. Local fauna, extremely hostile. Survival rate for stranded visitors, less than 2%. As another roar echoed across the landscape, closer this time, He-Jin felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away. She was a scientist, trained to observe, analyze, and adapt. If she was going to die here, she wouldn't do it crying in a broken pod. She checked her pistol's charge, gathered her supplies, and began planning her next move. The forest ahead looked dense enough to provide cover, and her species' natural ability to sense electromagnetic fields might help her detect predators before they got too close. "Focus on what you can control," she muttered to herself, remembering her old academy instructor's words. "Observe, analyze, adapt, survive." She took one last look at the purple sky where the stellar dawn had disappeared, then turned toward the forest. She had no idea that in a few weeks her path would cross with a human whose arrival would change everything. But for now, she had to focus on surviving the next few hours. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the pod made her freeze. Something big was coming, and she was about to find out just how dangerous this world really was. He-Jin pressed herself against the inner wall of the crashed pod as the footsteps grew closer. Each impact made the vessel shake, sending loose equipment rattling across the floor. Through the cracked viewport, she caught glimpses of movement, something large and crystalline, its surface reflecting the purple light of the alien sky. The creature circled the pod, its body making a sound like grinding glass. He-Jin held her breath, grateful that her damaged ship hadn't started leaking fuel. Her species' ability to sense electromagnetic fields was screaming warnings at her. This thing was alive, and it was hungry. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the crystalline predator moved away, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. He-Jin let out a shaky breath and checked her suit's oxygen levels. She had about 6 hours of breathable air left. "Think," she whispered to herself. "You're a scientist, analyzed the situation. She pulled out her datapad and began making notes. The planet's surface temperature was barely tolerable even in her environmental suit. The air was toxic, a mixture of nitrogen, sulfur, and several gases her sensors couldn't identify. But most concerning were the life forms her pod scanners had detected before crashing. The readings showed dozens of large creatures within a 5-kilometer radius, many of them similar to the crystalline beast that had just visited. Their biology was unlike anything she'd studied before. Silicon-based life forms that seemed to use sound waves not just for communication, but for hunting and defense. He-Jin gathered her supplies into a survival pack. The emergency rations, medical kit, energy pistol, and what remained of her scientific equipment. She also found a broken piece of metal from the pod's interior that could serve as a makeshift weapon if needed. The forest ahead was dense with strange, purple-black vegetation. The trees, if you could call them that, were more like giant fungi, their surfaces covered in patterns that pulsed with bioluminescent light. At least they might provide some cover. Before leaving the relative safety of the pod, He-Jin used her datapad to record a message. "This is Dr. He-Jin of the research vessel Stellar Dawn. If anyone finds this, Captain Duwan is developing illegal biological weapons. The evidence is stored in my quarters aboard his ship. He tried to kill me to keep this secret. If I don't survive, please make sure justice is served." She tucked the datapad securely into her pack and took her first steps onto the alien soil. The ground was surprisingly firm, covered in a layer of crystalline fragments that crunched under her boots. She winced at the noise. Sound seemed to carry far in this environment. The forest was about 200 meters away. He-Jin moved slowly, stopping frequently to scan for electromagnetic signatures that might indicate nearby predators. The purple sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that made every rock and crystal formation look like a potential threat. She was halfway to the tree line when she heard it, a high-pitched resonating sound that made her teeth vibrate. Her electromagnetic sense tingled with warning. Something was coming, and it was coming fast. He-Jin broke into a run, her boots crunching loudly on the crystalline ground. Behind her, she could hear something pursuing, not the heavy footsteps of the first creature, but a lighter, faster movement accompanied by that terrible resonating sound. She reached the edge of the forest and dove between two massive fungal trees. Their bioluminescent patterns flared brightly at her touch, temporarily blinding her. When her vision cleared, she saw her pursuer. It was smaller than the first creature, about the size of a large earth wolf, but its body was made entirely of shifting crystal formations. As it moved, its crystals rubbed against each other, creating that awful resonating sound. Most terrifying were its sensory organs, clusters of crystalline structures that seemed to focus sound waves like biological sonar. He-Jin raised her energy pistol and fired. The shot struck the creature's crystal hide and dissipated harmlessly. The beast tilted its head, almost as if curious, then opened what passed for its mouth, a jagged collection of crystal shards that began to vibrate at an even higher frequency. Acting on instinct, He-Jin grabbed a loose crystal from the ground and struck it against a nearby rock. The sharp ringing sound made the creature pause, its sensory clusters twitching. "You hunt by sound," He-Jin muttered, her scientific mind racing despite the danger. "Which means sound might be your weakness too." She struck the crystals together again, harder this time. The creature took a step back, its crystalline body trembling. He-Jin continued striking the crystals, creating a cacophony of ringing sounds that seemed to disorient the predator. Finally, it turned and fled, leaving her alone in the growing darkness. But she couldn't celebrate yet. Night was falling, and her suit's oxygen supply was running low. She needed to find shelter and figure out how to survive in this hostile environment. The fungal forest offered some protection, but staying on the ground wasn't safe. He-Jin studied the massive trunks of the fungi, noting how they grew in clusters, their upper portions intertwining to create natural platforms and cavities. Using her broken piece of pod metal as a climbing aid, She managed to reach one of these cavities about 10 meters up. The space was small but defensible, and the bioluminescent patterns provided enough light to see by. Jin took stock of her situation. She had food for 3 days, assuming she rationed carefully. Her suit's oxygen recyclers would work for another few hours, but after that, she'd need to find a way to filter the planet's toxic atmosphere. She spent the next few hours studying the fungal trees around her. Their bioluminescent patterns seemed to respond to touch and vibration, suggesting some form of chemical or electrical response. More importantly, she noticed that the air inside the cavity was different from the atmosphere outside. Using her remaining scientific equipment, she analyzed the air within the fungal cavity. The toxic elements were present, but in much lower concentrations. The fungi were acting as natural filters. If I can understand how they do it, she said to herself, maybe I can use them to survive. The next few days fell into a pattern. During the daylight hours, Jin would carefully explore the area around her shelter, collecting samples and avoiding the crystalline predators. She learned that the smaller hunters used high-frequency sounds to flush out prey, while the larger ones produced low-frequency vibrations that could stun their victims. She discovered that certain types of crystals, when struck together, could create sounds that drove the predators away. She fashioned a crude alarm system around her shelter using strings of these crystals, which would ring when anything large approached. By her 5th day on the planet, she had managed to create a crude but effective air filtration system using layers of fungal tissue. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed her to conserve her suit's oxygen supply for emergencies. Her emergency beacon was still damaged, but she worked on it whenever she could, trying to boost its signal using parts salvaged from her other equipment. The chances of anyone picking up the signal were slim, but she had to try. At night, she would document her observations in her datapad, both as a scientific record and to keep herself sane. The loneliness was almost as dangerous as the predators. Sometimes she found herself talking to the bioluminescent fungi, which would pulse in response to her voice. "At least you're good listeners," she told them one evening, watching their patterns shift and dance. 2 weeks into her exile, Jin had become something of an expert on survival in this hostile world. She had mapped the territories of different predator groups, learned their hunting patterns, and discovered which areas were relatively safe during different parts of the day. But her food supplies were running dangerously low, and she knew she would soon have to take greater risks to survive. She had identified some fungal growths that might be edible based on their chemical composition, but testing them would be dangerous. As she sat in her shelter that night, watching the purple sun set through the crystalline forest canopy, Jin thought about her mother. Had she faced a similar situation? Had Do-1 arranged another accident to silence her? "I won't let him win," she promised herself, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I'll find a way off this planet, and I'll make sure everyone knows what he's done." She didn't know it then, but help was closer than she thought. High above the planet's toxic atmosphere, a small research vessel called Wanderlust was about to pick up the faint signals from her jerry-rigged beacon, and its sole occupant, a human named Marcus Cooper, was about to change everything. But for now, Jin curled up in her fungal shelter, listening to the strange sounds of this alien world, and prepared herself for another day of survival against impossible odds. Marcus Cooper sat in the pilot's chair of his small research vessel, Wanderlust, frowning at the sensor readings on his screen. He ran his hand through his short brown hair, a habit he'd developed during his years of solo research expeditions. "Nova, run that scan again," he told his ship's eye. "I'm seeing something weird in the electromagnetic spectrum." "Running scan," Nova replied in her calm voice. "Warning, planet KX-291 is classified as extremely dangerous. Council regulations require." "I know the regulations, Nova," Marcus interrupted, leaning closer to his screen. "But that signal, it's not natural. Someone's down there." The signal was weak and irregular, but it had a pattern that suggested artificial origin. Marcus had spent enough time studying alien worlds to know the difference between natural phenomena and distress calls, even badly damaged ones. Biological scans indicate multiple large predators in the area of the signal, Nova warned. Survival probability, less than 8.2%. Marcus smiled. You know how I feel about probabilities, Nova. Take us down. The Wanderlust was small compared to most research vessels, but its size made it perfect for atmospheric entry. As they descended through the purple clouds, Marcus checked his environmental suit and equipment. His landing site would put him about a kilometer from the signal source. Local atmosphere is highly toxic, Nova reported. Suit oxygen supply will last approximately 12 hours. Noted, Marcus said, strapping on his utility belt. It carried standard research tools, medical supplies, and his pulse rifle, a weapon he hoped he wouldn't need to use. The ship landed softly on the crystalline surface, its advanced stabilizers handling the rough terrain easily. Through the viewport, Marcus could see the strange fungal forest glowing with bioluminescent patterns. Beautiful, he whispered. Then he heard the deep, resonating roar in the distance. And deadly, perfect combination. As Marcus stepped out onto the planet's surface, his boots crunching on the crystal shards, he activated his suit's sensors. They immediately picked up multiple large life forms in the area, their crystalline bodies giving off unique energy signatures. Nova, keep the ship's defenses active, he ordered. I'm going to find our mystery survivor. He moved carefully through the alien landscape, his trained eyes noting signs of activity. Broken crystals, marks on the fungal trees, and most importantly, footprints that were definitely not made by the local wildlife. The signal grew stronger as he approached the forest. Marcus noticed crude warning systems made of crystalline chimes. Clever work by someone who understood the local predator's sensitivity to sound. A movement caught his eye. Something darting between the fungal trees above. Not a predator's movement, but something smaller, more deliberate. Someone was watching him. Hello, he called out, keeping his voice calm, and raised his hands to show he was not a threat. I'm here to help. I picked up your signal. There was no response, but he felt eyes on him. Marcus reached slowly into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, standard issue emergency food that most spacefaring species could eat. I brought food, he said, holding it up, and medical supplies. My name is Marcus Cooper. I'm a human researcher. A voice came from above, cautious but clear. Human. From Earth. That's right, Marcus replied, staying still. I'm alone, just doing independent research. My ship picked up your distress signal. There was a long pause, then a figure climbed down from the fungal trees with practiced ease. It was a Neurian female, her silvery skin dulled by exhaustion, and her environmental suit patched in several places. Despite her obvious fatigue, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to survive in this hostile environment. I'm Hajin, she said, keeping a safe distance. How do I know you're not working for Captain Duwan? Marcus frowned. I don't know any Captain Duwan. I was studying the crystalline life forms in this sector when I picked up your signal. Look, here's my research license. He slowly pulled out his official Galactic Council documentation, letting her examine it from where she stood. Hei-jin's large eyes scanned the document, then looked back at him with a mix of hope and suspicion. The council knows about my situation, she asked. No, Marcus admitted. I'm here unofficially, but I can help you contact them. What happened? Before Hei-jin could answer, a high-pitched resonating sound cut through the air. Marcus spun around to see one of the smaller crystal predators emerging from behind a fungal trunk, its body vibrating with hunting frequencies. Without hesitation, Marcus raised his pulse rifle, but Hei-jin grabbed his arm. No, she warned. The sound of the shot will attract more of them. Here. She quickly handed him a crystal shard and struck her own against a nearby formation. The ringing sound made the predator pause, its sensory clusters twitching in confusion. Marcus caught on quickly, striking his crystal in harmony with hers. The combined frequencies drove the creature back until it finally turned and fled into the forest. That was impressive, Marcus said, looking at He-Jin with new respect. You've learned a lot about their behavior. I had to, she replied, some of her suspicion fading. I've been here for 16 days, but my food ran out yesterday, and my air filtration system is failing. Marcus offered her the ration bar again, and this time she took it. As she ate, he noticed how she kept scanning their surroundings, her body tense and ready to move at any sign of danger. My ship is about 1 kilometer from here, he said. It's well defended and has plenty of supplies. You'll be safe there. He-Jin finished the ration bar and studied him carefully. Why are you helping me? You don't know me, and this planet is dangerous. Marcus smiled, because it's the right thing to do, and because anyone who can survive 16 days here alone deserves help. Besides, I'm a scientist too. I can see the research equipment you've modified to survive. That's clever work. A low rumble shook the ground, and both of them tensed. One of the larger predators was nearby. We should move, He-Jin said, already gathering her essential equipment. The big ones hunt at this time of day. As they made their way through the forest, He-Jin told Marcus about Captain Du-Won's illegal weapons research and how she'd been left to die. Marcus listened carefully, his expression growing serious. That's why you asked if I worked for him, he said as they climbed over a fallen fungal trunk. He has connections in the council. He-Jin nodded. He said he had powerful friends. That's why I was afraid to trust anyone who might come looking for me. Well, I have some friends in the council too, Marcus said. And they're the kind who hate corrupt officials and illegal weapons. But first, let's get you to safety. They were about halfway to the ship when He-Jin's electromagnetic sense tingled with warning. She grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him behind a large crystal formation, just as two massive predators emerged from the forest ahead. The creatures were huge, their crystalline bodies catching the purple sunlight and throwing rainbow patterns across the ground. They moved with surprising grace for their size, their low-frequency hunting calls making the very air vibrate. They're blocking our path to the ship, Marcus whispered, checking his rifle's charge. There's another way, He-Jin said quietly. Through the fungal canopy. The crystals up there are smaller. The big ones can't climb well because their sound waves don't work as effectively among the upper branches. Marcus looked up at the dense network of fungal branches above them. Lead the way. You're the expert here. He-Jin showed him how to climb the fungal trunks, using natural handholds and avoiding the more sensitive areas that would trigger bright bioluminescent reactions. Despite never having done this before, Marcus followed her lead with impressive adaptability. A trait she had heard was common among humans. They moved through the canopy for nearly half an hour, the giant predators passing beneath them several times. He-Jin noticed that Marcus never complained about the difficult journey, even when they had to cross particularly treacherous gaps between fungal clusters. Finally, they reached a point where they could see the Wanderlust through the purple haze. The ship was smaller than He-Jin had expected, but it looked well maintained and, most importantly, safe. Nova. Marcus spoke into his suit's comm. 2 coming in. Activate defense perimeter, but hold fire. We got some large natives in the area, and we don't want to aggravate them. A calm female voice responded. Acknowledged, Marcus. Defense systems on standby. Welcome back. As they carefully descended to ground level, He-Jin felt tears forming in her eyes. After 16 days of constant fear and survival, she was finally looking at a way off this deadly world. Once we're aboard, Marcus said, helping her over a crystal outcropping, we can contact the council members I trust. Du-Won won't get away with what he did. He-Jin looked at the human who had risked his life to save a stranger, and for the first time in over 2 weeks, she felt hope. Thank you, she said simply. Marcus grinned. Don't thank me yet. We still have to get past those big fellows over there. He pointed at 3 more crystal predators that had just emerged from the forest, their massive forms blocking the direct path to the ship. But instead of feeling fear, Ho-Jin found herself smiling too. "Well then," she said, pulling out her crystalline chimes, "let me show you another trick I learned about dealing with these creatures." The purple sun was setting on another day on KX 291, but for Ho-Jin, it no longer felt like a countdown to disaster. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, a chance for justice, and perhaps even friendship with this surprising human who had changed everything. Ho-Jin pulled 3 crystal shards from her pack, handing 2 to Marcus. "Strike them in this pattern," she explained, tapping out a rhythm. "The combined frequencies will disorient them long enough for us to reach your ship." Marcus nodded, following her lead. The crystals rang out in harmony, creating waves of sound that made the massive predators shake their crystalline heads in confusion. The creatures backed away, their hunting calls becoming disorganized. "Now," Ho-Jin shouted, "run." They sprinted toward the Wanderlust, their boots crunching on the crystal-covered ground. The predators were still disoriented, but Ho-Jin knew it wouldn't last long. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but the sight of the ship's open hatch drove her forward. "Nova, start engines," Marcus called out as they ran. "Be ready for immediate takeoff." They were 20 meters from the ship when one of the crystal beasts recovered. It let out a deep, resonating roar that shook the ground. Ho-Jin stumbled, her legs going weak from the vibrations. Marcus caught her arm, half carrying her as they ran. "Almost there," he encouraged. "Just a few more steps." The creature charged, its massive crystalline body creating a symphony of grinding sounds. Ho-Jin could feel its thundering footsteps through the ground, getting closer with each step. They reached the ship's ramp just as the beast lunged. Marcus pushed Ho-Jin inside and spun around, firing his pulse rifle. The shot struck the creature's face, sending crystal shards flying. The beast reared back, giving them the seconds they needed to get inside. "Nova, close hatch. Get us out of here," Marcus ordered as they collapsed on the ship's floor, breathing hard. The Wanderlust's engines roared to life. Through the viewport, Ho-Jin watched the crystal predators shrinking away as they rose into the purple sky. Within minutes, they had broken through the atmosphere, leaving the deadly world behind. Ho-Jin felt tears rolling down her cheeks. After 16 days of constant fear and survival, she was finally safe. She turned to thank Marcus, but he was already heading to the ship's communication console. "Nova, secure channel to Council Member Lee Su," he said, typing quickly. "Priority 1. A few moments later, an elderly Neurian woman appeared on the screen. Her silver skin had the deep ridges of age, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "Marcus," she said, then noticed Ho-Jin. "What's going on?" "Council Member Lee Su," Marcus said formally. "I just rescued a Neurian scientist from KX 291. She has evidence of illegal weapons research being conducted by a Captain Du-1 of the research vessel Stellar Dawn." Ho-Jin stepped forward, her voice steadied despite her exhaustion. "Council Member, I have proof that Captain Du-1 is using biological samples to develop weapons that violate Council treaties. He tried to kill me to keep it secret." Lee Su's expression darkened. "Du-1. I've had suspicions about him for years, but he's always been too careful. You have evidence." Ho-Jin pulled out her data crystal. "Everything is here." He claimed to have powerful friends in the Council protecting him. "No friends powerful enough to escape justice," Lee Su said firmly. "Marcus, bring her to the Council station in Sector 7. I'll have a team ready to receive your evidence and take your statement, and I'll dispatch ships to intercept the Stellar Dawn." After the communication ended, Marcus showed Ho-Jin to the ship's small medical bay. As she sat on the examination table, letting the automated system treat her minor injuries, she studied the human who had saved her life. "Why did you really come down to that planet?" she asked. "The risk was enormous." Marcus smiled as he checked the medical readouts. Humans have a saying, the right thing to do and the easy thing to do are rarely the same thing. When I saw that signal, I knew someone needed help. Everything else was secondary. Is that a common trait among humans? We're all different, Marcus said, applying a healing patch to a cut on her arm. But yeah, many of us have a hard time walking away when someone needs help. Gets us into trouble sometimes, but also leads to amazing discoveries and friendships. Over the next few days, as they traveled to the council station, Hei-Jin learned more about her rescuer. Marcus was a xenobiologist like her, but he preferred working alone, exploring the lesser-known corners of the galaxy. His ship's AI, Nova, was more of a partner than a computer, helping him navigate and conduct research. They spent hours discussing their scientific observations, especially about the crystal creatures. Hei-Jin's detailed notes on their behavior excited Marcus, who had been studying silicon-based life forms for years. Your survival techniques were brilliant, he told her as they reviewed her data, using their sound sensitivity against them, creating those warning systems with crystal chimes. That's groundbreaking research. I was just trying to stay alive, Hei-Jin said modestly. Sometimes the best discoveries come from necessity, Marcus replied. Would you consider collaborating on a paper about it? From a safe distance this time. When they reached the council station, things moved quickly. Li Su had prepared thoroughly. Security teams took Hei-Jin's evidence and testimony, while other council ships moved to intercept the Stellar Dawn. Du-Wan was arrested 3 days later, along with several high-ranking council members who had been protecting his illegal research. Hei-Jin's data crystal contained enough evidence to ensure they would all face justice. Your mother would be proud, Li Su told Hei-Jin after the arrests. She was my friend, you know. When she discovered similar weapons research years ago, Du-Wan arranged her accident before she could reach me. But this time, thanks to you and your human friend, we got him. Hei-Jin looked through the station's viewport at the stars beyond. What happens now? That depends on you, Li Su said. The Council's Xenobiology Division would be honored to have you join us. Your experience and research would be valuable. Actually, Hei-Jin said slowly, I was thinking about something different. Marcus and I were talking about continuing our research on silicon-based life forms. There are other planets with crystal ecosystems, safer ones. Our combined expertise could lead to important discoveries. Li Su smiled. A human and Neorian research team. That's unusual. So is surviving 16 days on KX-291. Hei-Jin pointed out. Sometimes unusual is good. A week later, Hei-Jin stood in the Wanderlust's small lab, setting up her equipment. Marcus was in the pilot's seat, plotting their course to a promising system he had identified. Course set for the crystal caves of Epsilon IV. Nova announced. Estimated travel time. 3 days. Ready for another adventure? Marcus asked, looking back at Hei-Jin. This planet's supposed to be much friendlier than KX-291. Hei-Jin checked her newly issued pulse rifle and emergency beacon. She wasn't taking any chances this time. Ready. Though maybe we should collect samples together instead of splitting up. Definitely, Marcus agreed. Partners keep each other safe. As the Wanderlust jumped into hyperspace, Hei-Jin thought about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had lost everything, survived against impossible odds, helped bring down a criminal operation, and found a new purpose. And it was all because a human had decided to investigate a weak distress signal on a deadly planet. Marcus, she said, thank you. Not just for saving me, but for showing me that sometimes the most amazing discoveries come from taking chances on people. Marcus grinned. That's another thing about humans. We're pretty good at turning disaster into opportunity. Now, want to help me calibrate these sensors? I have a feeling we're going to find something extraordinary out there. Hei-Jin joined him at the control panel, her silver skin reflecting the colorful lights of hyperspace. She didn't know exactly what they would discover on their journey together, but she knew it would be interesting. After all, She had learned that when humans decided to help, impossible things became possible. And somewhere behind them, on a purple planet orbiting a distant star, crystal creatures still roamed among glowing fungal forests, their haunting calls echoing across a world that had taught her the true meaning of survival, friendship, and the unexpected ways that justice could find its path across the stars.